everybody?
We can see them.
Right, right. Thank you. And once again, greetings to all of you, and especially Venerable Jnanasiha Thero and the other bhikkhus. May I start with the reverse way of I would like to acknowledge the help that I have received primarily from Venerable Jnanasiha Thero, who helped me with some of the words and the spellings involved in this presentation, the Pali words. Much merit to you, Bhante, as always, ever so kind and helpful. And also, I have to make very special mention of Bhante S. Dhammika of Australia, who very kindly even shared with me an unpublished work of his, a book. I can't quite remember its name. I think it has got the word banquet. Is it banquet for the Buddha? Or anyway, that was a large impetus for me. I felt quite encouraged that there was so much of material in the Tripitaka in and around this topic. So with much merit to both those Bhantes and for your presence, let us then begin. The topic, as you know, is Jigaccā paramā rogā, or hunger is the worst illness. Dhamma friends, I would first like to justify this presentation, the importance of hunger in the here and now. This would be the sort of roadmap of what I'm going to do as shown on this slide. And then take an in-depth look at this, what this title actually means, both from from all three, the health perspective, a Buddhist perspective, and the social point of view. I would then like to relook at what else is in the Tripitaka about hunger and food. The Buddha's teachings on food and eating is yet another sort of little subsection. Famines in the time of the Buddha, causes and the consequences, and the implications of poverty and hunger, which go so closely hand in hand on society. And finally, some relief measures, which are not obviously confined to any religion, but into all humanity. Right. So let us then get going. Why now is the next, why is it so urgent now? And we are now facing sort of world hunger, we are told, on the verge of a global food crisis. And the main reason given on the internet for the world, as it were, is that two top sort of food producers are at war with each other. So the Russia versus Ukraine is given as one of the main causes, in the back, having come directly after this epidemic, which is not quite over, but that has had a huge blow with the lockdowns and caused a lot of hardships and food insecurities. Of course, natural disasters, climate changes, and so forth. Right at the bottom of the list of this sort of global food crisis, one finds government policy, and also mismanagement and government policy sometimes. Now, that has been one of the main reasons in Sri Lanka, in addition, of course, no doubt, the lack of the bread and stuff coming from Ukraine would have a bearing, and no doubt the COVID-19 epidemic, the pandemic that we have just been through. However, what really tipped the tipping point was there, and then what happened was the government policy. So whether this got included in the list as a result of the Sri Lanka was the cause of it or not, I wouldn't know. However, the Sri Lankan situation is such that we sort of suddenly plummeted down an abyss, as you can see from this slide, which shows the global hunger index, which is said to be a very comprehensive and good method of looking at the trends. Just in 2021, this is based on a calculated score. So the figure 16 is just a score, it doesn't have any bearing. But the fact that we were just next to being all right, this was last year as well. And so we are suddenly now plunged down this situation. So this is the reason that I thought of speaking on this topic, and having noted Buddha's words, which I used to use in my malnutrition lectures, Jigaccā, paramā, rogā, the Buddhist perspective. I have to tell you that I'm not a nutritionist, nor a social scientist, or an economist, or any such thing, but a pediatrician. But having been a developing country pediatrician, I think, or any pediatrician anywhere in the world, one has to know at least one or two things about hunger and nutrition. So that's my only qualification in that sense. Now, this statement has been translated as hunger is the worst illness, the worst sickness, and even the worst disease. And I also find it being as the worst ailment. Now, we have all heard that rogā paramā. In fact, recently the Director General of WHO was seen to be mentioning this, the Pali words of the Buddha from the Dhammapada, and which means that good health is the greatest asset that one could have. So that is arogya, is good health. So perhaps rogā could mean ill health, I was wondering, but then much the same. And so this is what we are going to deal with today. And this statement that was made by the Buddha in a Dhammapada. But 26 centuries later, there has been intensive and extensive research into nutrition and its bearing on humans. And what is today the status is that the amount of food and the constituents of food play a massive role in health at a very cellular or even intracellular level. They work as substrates and cofactors, and it is a very, very important aspect in health. And it's not just the loss of weight and what can be grossly seen. There is also, research tells us today's sort of state-of-the-art nutrition knowledge is that there is hidden hunger, micronutrient deficiencies. It could be vitamin A or zinc. Iron was, of course, well known for some maybe decades. So let us look at this example of, for example, vitamin D deficiency played a huge role. None of us would have known that we were having this. It was a hidden hunger, but it played such an important role in either keeping us healthy and away from the COVID-19 infection, and also played a part in the recovery, and in, if we did get it, in whether we could avoid a fatal outcome or not. So hidden hunger has faced, and without a doubt, we find from the statistics, world statistics, more people died of malnutrition during this pandemic than of COVID-19 deaths. So malnutrition overran COVID-19, and in fact, the coronavirus turned out to be called the hunger virus. So not that the virus itself caused it, but there it is. The compounding factors can be calamitous, but that apart, malnutrition per se is a huge situation in many parts of the world. We know that there is a huge crisis in neighboring countries, for example, in Afghanistan. So much for the biological and medical aspects in a nutshell. The social aspects we will be dealing with later on in this presentation. Now, let us look again at Jigaccā paramā rogā, which is from the Dhammapada, verse 203. And I like to start with the background, or what's called the Nidāna Katha of the Dhammapada. It's centers around a poor man who was nearing Sotapatti fruition, or he was just at the verge of advancing in his progress along the path, a significant milestone. And the Buddha was visiting that village, and the Buddha, with his wisdom, which we call the Mahakaruna Samapatya, he could look around and see who was most worthy or able to understand this deep Dhamma. He saw this man, but this man was also very keen on coming to hear the expounding of the Dhamma, but his cattle had strayed and he was in search of his oxen. And the Buddha waited for him because he had to find this and then harness them. And when he did arrive, exhausted, the people who had come who were sitting, the devotees, couldn't explain, wondered why there was this long silence of wait, unusual delay. When this man comes running in, exhausted, and the Buddha requests the organizers to please give him some food to eat before listening to the Dhamma. On the way back that day, the disciples, Buddha's disciples, inquired from the Buddha as to why there was this delay in starting and so forth, and what they saw. And then that the Buddha recited this, mentioned this Dhammapada, which is Jigaccā, paramā, rogā, which is that hunger is the worst illness. And the Dhammapada, sometimes I found it also saying khandhas or sankhara, paramā, dukkha, meaning the aggregates bring the greatest suffering. Etam natva yata bhutam, natva, the wise, see these things as it is, yata bhutam, and realize that Nibbana is the highest bliss. Now, what is the takeaway message on this would be that hunger, by affecting concentration and the ability to contemplate on what you hear, sort of has a negative effect on the ability to absorb the Dhamma. So hunger affects the ability to absorb the Dhamma. And there are many other examples like this in the stories around the Buddha's teachings, where Buddha wants people to be first fed if they are hungry before they listen to the Dhamma. And it's always also said that if a person is always hungry, he would be chronic hunger, he would be thinking of food all the time and become obsessed with the thought of food. And that is not in keeping with liberation and giving up of tanha. And the loss of energy, which the Buddha himself had his own personal experience, as we saw in that image that I projected at the start, after severe austerities during his search for enlightenment, that it was unhelpful in reaching enlightenment. Self-mortification was a practice that was present then, as it is sometimes even now, as a means of liberating oneself, but that was not helpful. So severe austerities are not recommended, and so forth. So that is how the real meaning on how this statement came to be pronounced. I would also like to give your attention, Dhamma friends, to this sutta, which is in the Itivuttaka, again in the Kuddaka Nikaya, on dana, which many of you would have heard, where the Buddha says, "O monks, if people knew as I know the results of giving and sharing of food, they would not eat without having given, nor would they allow the stain of stinginess to obsess them and take root in their minds. And even if it is the last morsel of food or the last mouthful, they would not eat it without sharing it if there was someone to share it with." And he goes on to say, "But monks, people don't know as I know the results of giving, and therefore they eat without having given." Now, this obviously shows the value of giving and sharing of food. And the aim is to prevent hunger, which the Buddha saw as something absolutely awful. And my own take, I think, is by the Buddha saying, as I know, if they knew as I know, is that he probably has seen this in its entirety throughout the sansaric lives, how all of us perhaps at various times in samsara have suffered very severe hunger. And he sees how much, and for example, the animal world, we know that they're all, one of their major tasks for the day is just to keep looking for food. So that is hunger, the driver. And so for this reason, I think that is what is meant by seeing the horrors than more than what we can see at a given time under normal circumstances. And we have all heard of these hungry ghosts or hungry spirits, the pretas, which is a plane of existence in a woeful state, where that existence is one that for that long years that one is entrapped there. You're eternally hungry and thirsty. These are depicted as having a tiny mouth and a huge belly, and they suffer in accordance with their kamma of having shown greed and selfishness and so forth. So this is why the fear of samsara, again, we meet face to face, and why the giving is so good. In fact, we know that in the olden days, we all remember, I think, certainly our grandparents' time. I remember my grandmother would keep a little bit of food aside at the start of the meal. But it is said that even at the end of the meal, if you think with the intention of feeding, if you throw away even the leftovers, or for that matter, the water that was used to rinse the dishes, if it is discarded in a way, think that it could be of some use to the worms or birds or whatever the creatures, it is meritorious. So that's what all of this goes to say. The Buddhist perspective on hunger is a very dangerous phenomenon, feeling, suffering that is there, and one might be knocking on the door of that, either in this life with the famine, or worse still, in situations where we don't have any control, where we are in a spirit world. Right, now let us then look at some of the other, what else there is in the Tripitaka on food and hunger. And we find this statement, Sabbe Satta Aharattika, which is all beings subsist on food. And also, Ayam Kayo Aharattiko, the body subsists on food. Interestingly, we also find this statement that food provides sustenance. Tittati, the ability to, the current situation, paticca, I think, is dependent on aharam. So aharam paticca tittati, this current status, we is having due to food, and anaharo, in the absence of food, na tittati, there would be no sustenance. And the Buddha has equaled the pangs of hunger as the worst kind of pain. As narasa anyam, there is no greater pain for man than that caused by hunger. And it has been likened, sama aggi, to a fire burning. Hunger is likened to that. So probably the word Badagini, I don't know whether that is how it came about. We know the the huge influence the Pali and Tripitaka Buddhism has had on the Sinhalese language. So anyway, there we find that it has been likened to a fire burning. And food has to be, one has to remember drink with food, because that they go together and they're all part and parcel of it. Let us look at some of the other, what's said in the Tripitaka. Chattaro Pacha are the 4 requisites that even a monk or a nun who has, taken to robes, who has renounced the world, requires. There are 4 requisites: Shivara, Pindapata, Senasana, Gilana, Pacha, which we know. And to date, this what the Buddha said so many centuries ago, 26 centuries ago, is all that the United Nations still says that the refugees would need. Chivara is clothing, Pindapata food, so it's food, clothing, Senasana is a shelter, and medicine. So food, these are the 4 requisites that are provided. Now, and of course, all beings need nutrients. So to come back to food, we have an Ahara Sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, which I think is one of the most beautiful suttas that I have found from my understanding, helped me with my understanding. But it certainly has a deep meaning, and Arahant Sariputta in the Sammaditthi Sutta, it's this ahara, the approach to nutrients or food, the ahara vara, is given as the second out of 16 varas in the Sammaditthi Sutta, the 16 approaches that through which, through any of these, you could reach the right view, which is all important, the eventual, the highest goal, as it were. So Ahara Sutta, let us spend a few minutes looking at Ahara Sutta. Now here it deals with the 4 nutriments. The Buddha speaks of 4 nutriments that feed the body and the mind. These 4 are, it begins with the physical food, which is called Kabalinkara, Kabalinka Ahara, which is the physical food that we eat. It nourishes the body. The other 3 are all what feeds the mind. And we know that that's contacts or perceptions that come through the sense bases, is the passa. Then up to that, we can't help. The passas will keep coming as long as those sense organs are working, unless we have to know how to handle them. If not, we go into the next phase where these, what is called mano samcetana, which is the mental volition. We start constructing on these perceptions, and then there is volition and consciousness, vijnana. So what the Ahara Sutta in brief deals with is that clinging these 4 nutriments is what keeps us going in this life, as well as in samsara. So we keep, as is obvious, in our day-to-day work is dependent on our food, then what we hear and see and smell, and what we think, which is also one of the sense bases in Buddhism. There are not 5 but 6 senses with the mind, and that leads us on to our volition, what we did, whether we decided to come today or not, or whatever. So that's the Ahara Sutta, and how to control all that. We control our actions, our words, and our thoughts above all. Now, the Buddha's words on food also shows that rice, we find in the Tripitaka, looking at the incidental things in the Tripitaka, in and around the teachings, we find that rice was the main food crop in the Majjhima Desa, according to Bhante Dhammika of Australia. And a few weeks ago, he spoke to us, and you may remember, some of you, that he said that the plant that is most often referred to in the Tripitaka is not the lotus, but the rice, the paddy plant. Now, in the time of the Buddha, Brahmanism was very prevalent. And in that Brahminical teaching, there are long lists of what should be eaten and when to eat this. So there are very complex prescriptions. And we find that even today, it's very hard, these old habits die very hard. I find as a pediatrician, mothers will not give some food because the next door neighbor, this type of plantain is not good. Why? Because the next door neighbor says that her child reacted badly, and whether that was a sequence or a consequence, even we don't know. So it goes on what to eat. You people like to hear and stay away from that, thinking that was the way to deal with things. And but in the Brahmanism, there was also with whom one should eat and with whom one should not eat. Whereas the Buddha's teachings were very different. Buddha's teachings, as you know, obviously grounded on very compassionate reasons. That is one aspect of the Buddha's teachings. It's always compassionate. The other is that it is rational. rational, and therefore scientific. And to date, science has not been able to disprove any of that teaching, as we have found up to now about the nutrition being very dangerous over and above the infections and the pandemic. Right. Now, therefore, the Buddha says it's your, because the accent was on the impurities in the mind. Impurity is not in food, but in your mind. And therefore, there was no long list of taboos given by the Buddha saying, don't eat this and don't eat that. Of course, there's one big strict taboo, and that is no alcohol and no intoxicants. That's because it will affect the clarity of your thought, which is number one importance in Buddhism. So that's the strict taboo. And the teaching is to eat in moderation. Whatever it is you're eating, controlling the greed and clinging, tanha and upadana, must be controlled. Also, you have to be grateful to whatever. There's a long process in which the food comes onto our plate. There is a lot to be grateful for. So you accept food offered with gratitude, but you have to be content with what you have, if it is what is given to you, that is. And of course, restraint and equanimity, meaning it's not that you would reject things or like them. This is particularly relevant to the monks and nuns when they go on the alms rounds. So equanimity is something that is that has to be developed, and it is fairly advanced if one has developed that to that extent. But here, even with food, it is important that you don't reject something, or that you don't have too much greed on it, but you can take it with an even keel. Now, of course, we said it is compassionate, so all animals have a right to life. And selling of meat was a forbidden trade. In the time of the Buddha, in the Buddha's teaching, there were 5 trades that were absolutely forbidden. And you would remember them as the selling of meat, the selling of intoxicants, the selling of alcohol, selling of ammunition, and slave trade of humans and that aspect. So those are the 5 trades. Now, therefore, not to accept meat is what was told to the monks. If they knew it was specifically killed for them, or even if they knew, or even they suspected of it, they should not, or if they heard, they should not accept that. But otherwise, they had to accept what they were given. Now, if this looks a bit strange, so there was no strict vegetarianism as such, because you can't go on alms rounds and keep dictating terms. So this was the sort of spirit in which an alms round is taken, the pindapata, as we call, or pindachara, which many Buddhist Theravada countries still engage in a big way, like in Myanmar and also in Thailand. You would go around acceptance of whatever is given. And there is a beautiful Dhammapada on that, as that the alms round should be like a bee on a flower without harming its scent and color, how the bee would, take the honey from the nectar from the flower without harming its scent or color, and gathers the nectar and flies away. As such, in a village, a monk will behave. So it is in that spirit that they will not, they will accept what is given, and also it teaches equanimity. Now, however, this is further very beautifully illustrated in this sutta, the Amagandha Sutta, which I like to mention. The Amagandhas were a group of ascetics who used to have strict regimes of meditation and also virtue, and they were up in the hills, and they were strict vegetarians. So once in a way they used to come down, and they were very well treated by the villagers. And once when they came down, they found the villagers were otherwise involved, very excited about the Buddha having arrived. And these people also thought, they were very happy to meet an enlightened one. But they were very surprised that there was no strict vegetarianism. And so then the Buddha expounds this sutta. And what he says is that being rough and harmful and hurtful is what will make you impure, not just the eating of meat. In other words, the other side of the coin is by just not eating meat, you won't become pure. You have to get rid of these characteristics. Having anger, envy, hatred, and so forth, there are a lot more. I have only put a few to not make the slide too busy, is the way it's not just not eating meat. And stealing, cheating, and exploiting, even exploiting of labor is taken as cheating or stealing, is not the way, but just not eating meat, but you have to get rid of these impurities. So the accent of the teaching is on eradicating impure thoughts. And that, again, this highlights the rational thinking of it. And however, vegetarianism is to be applauded, and it is to be wherever possible, but not on an arm's round. There was also, however, certain Vinaya rules of how not to obtain food and the time of consuming. So there are Vinaya rules about food, not that you can do it as you please, but strict vegetarianism was not part of it in early Buddhism. And of course, elephant and horse flesh was taboo, even by the Buddha, because there was a royal decree at that time. And even today, I think in the UK, the swan is a protected animal, because once upon a time, I think it would have been Henry VIII, if I can make a guess, who enjoyed the swan meat, and therefore he didn't want the swans killed. And there was this royal decree not to sell. So there are odd reasons for these, but whatever it is, when there is a royal decree, you should not eat that meat, and you should not accept that and be, violating that. So that's so much, but all in all, it's a compassionate teaching. And as I said, it highlights the rationality of the teachings. As to whom to eat with and whom not to eat with, I would like to just bring up this Sata Dhamma Jataka. I'm sure there may be more instances. It is one of when two men, a Brahmin and an untouchable, and the Bodhisattva was the untouchable. They had to travel through a very dangerous wilderness. So they happened to meet each other, and they thought it was good to join hands and travel because of the dangers. But the Bodhisattva had parcels of food for the journey. The Brahmin didn't, but the Brahmin couldn't eat with a untouchable, a low caste person, according to his teachings. So when the time came for the meal, the Bodhisattva offered, but he refused. And much later, on in the journey, and they came to the next time, the meal in the evening, the Bodhisattva didn't offer because he knew he wouldn't be accepted. And the travails that the Brahmin goes through is actually quite a comedy. I would not waste time on that, but how the sort of pickle he gets himself into after that, because he finds it very difficult to not eat some of that food because he's so ravishingly hungry, just shows the unreasonableness anyway. And there are no such rules. Of course, you could not associate with people who are, cheats or thieves or whatever. That's a different kettle of fish to eat together. Anyway, now let us look at what the Buddha taught. That's so much for food and drink. What about eating? There's teachings on fasting, teachings on mindful eating, teachings on overeating. So that's what I propose to do next for a few minutes. Now, long periods of fasting is not advocated, as we have sort of dealt with this. However, that noon to sunrise fast is a training in self-restraint for the monks and nuns on a daily basis, and for lay people on the training day or Uposatha day when we observe still noon to sunrise. However, the Buddha has said, I am healthy because I don't eat after noon. I confess I haven't found the reference in the Tripitaka for this, but I have seen it so often. I have put it without hesitation because I believe I've seen it from very erudite monks who say this, but I was unable to. So it's up to you to find, but I am healthy because I don't eat. But I do know that this tallies with today's scientific and nutritional advice or knowledge. From the hunter-gatherer days, people didn't eat at night, and a non-caloric fast of about 14 hours or 15 or 16 hours is said to be very good. And in our household now, it has become a practice. And I must say that occasionally I fail, but my husband, he doesn't eat at night. It's quite a thing now. And I must say, one doesn't feel, and on retreats, we don't feel hungry at all in the morning. And I don't even at home. The day, if I can manage to stay without, and I can, I should say, more often than not I can, but there are times when I fail. Now, so it is a time-restricted healthy dietary habit that was given to the monks and the nuns. Now let us look at the other end for a moment before we come to mindful eating, overeating, which is an issue now with obesity all in the world. Again, it is a form of malnutrition, though. Overeating is malnutrition, it ends up with. And now there was this King Pasenadi Kosala, a very interesting character, who used to come very often to meet the king, meet the Buddha. And there is so much that has been discussed and told to the king that there is an entire section of Kosala Sangyupta in the Tripitaka, because he came so very often, and it used to be often after his midday meal. And one day the Buddha could see how uncomfortable this king was. He had overeaten. And he asks him, why was anything wrong, O king? And he says, yes, I'm feeling very uncomfortable. I think, and the king himself says he has overeaten. So then the Buddha's advice on dieting is exemplary there. He focuses on the Vedana. I haven't brought in these lines which are too long, but with a limited knowledge of Pali, you could see that the word Vedana was there, which was the discomfort he was feeling. And Jirati, meaning aging, and Ayu, that it will be more conducive to your longevity if you didn't overeat. So these are the things that are shown, the positive thing, how good it would be not to have had this, rather than telling the dangers of it. So the benefits were told, of not eating, the benefits were told, which is what is called positive reinforcement, which is what today dietitians do. So we were at overeating, and that was another world first. I think, when did you lose me? I wouldn't know. But the overeating of King Pasenadi Kosala and that dietary advice that he was given. Yes, and the positive reinforcement methodology that was used by the Buddha, which is today what is being used by dietitians. Now, let us just look at mindful eating versus eating unmindfully, which is what we normally do when we eat. But when we go for retreats, we are made to eat mindfully. So that is something that we should continue even as much as possible at all times. Here is the stanza, a beautiful stanza that is recited at the start before eating by monks, where they that I eat in moderation, reflecting wisely, not for enjoyment and amusement that I'm eating, or not for physical attractiveness, but for the sustenance and continuation of this body, so as to live this holy life is why I'm eating. And also, by allaying hunger, I will end all desires and not let new ones arise. So there again, we know that hunger gives rise to greed and desire. So we eat, one of the reasons is to suppress that. Whereas the important message is that if we eat mindfully, we can watch as we eat the changes occurring in our body and mind, and the mind-body interaction as well. And eating mindfully helps you to control the senses instead of just gratifying the senses. In eating, it is mostly taste and smell that we are trying to gratify, but that is under control. And also, the Buddha's advice is to stop before the last 4 to 5 mouthfuls, which is more conducive to the meditative practice. So mindful eating has twofold benefits. It will help you to progress on the path, as well as it promotes good health. Now, excuse me for a minute. So I would like to next talk about very briefly, the 30 training rules, which you and I don't often hear about because it's in the Vinaya, for monks, which is known as the Sekya. 30 training rules about eating, which in fact are again a world first, as far as if you want to call them table manners. There couldn't be anything earlier than this, than what the Buddha says about how to eat appreciatively, eat methodically, and not looking at another's bowl. He even mentions how to make a rounded mouthful without, having pieces sticking out. Should not be extra large, and your cheeks must not bulge, not to that extent. And how to even place the food to the mouth, not to open the mouth until the food is near, and not to stuff the entire hand in, not to nibble on that, and not to smack the lips, not to eat noisily. And I think the Pali there show, actually, you hear it, the sound chapa chapa in Pali, so it's interesting. And not to speak with the mouth full, not to lick the fingers, not to lick the bowl, and not to scatter food around, not to shake the hand in such a way as to sort of shake off the food. All this is told. Even that the soiled hand should not be used when you receive the water container, and that the bowl that is rinsed has to be discarded appropriately. If there are pieces of, rice or whatever, then it should not be placed in certain places where people inhabit and things like that. So this is amazing, and it just shows how the Vinaya and how, in fact, how well disciplined and trained the monks should be, and are, shall we say, or should be, because sometimes we see them on the TV trying to break down barricades and things like that, but then obviously they are not monks. Now let's come to famine. Famine in the time of the Buddha, that it was a recurrent feature. Rivers would run dry after prolonged drought. It could happen. And we had the Buddha's words in the Anguttara Nikaya saying there is a famine, the harvest has failed, and getting alms food is difficult. So we have that sort of line that's taken out of one sutta. So there it is. We know for sure that there were famines. And there are plenty of references, as we heard from Bhante Dhammika that day. There is a lot on rice, cultivation, harvest, and also the rice fields. There's a lot on the paddy fields. I think even the robe has, the cuttings, those squares, and likened to. So there's a lot about the rice cultivation. And the paddy seed, there was popular belief that it was the one seed that could, absorb all the excellent material at that time of the earth. It was known as Tandula. And that, so there's a lot also about how to get a bountiful harvest. And there was a popular belief again, I believe the Buddha subscribed to it, that if the king is unjust, it rains at the wrong time, and the rains will fail when it should fail at the correct time. At that time, the wrong time, it will rain at the wrong time, and it will fail to rain at the correct time. So that's so much for the harvest. Now we have, of course, everybody has heard the Ratana Sutta, or every Buddhist has, the discourse of the three gems, being the qualities of the Buddha, the doctrine, and the order. And this was when there was in Vesali or Visala, a city, 3 fears, and that was again famine and disease. When they come together, it can be calamitous, and also evil spirits. So the Buddha was invited to please come and help out. He visited and they chanted the qualities of the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha. And to date, it is heard daily, I think, in most Buddhist homes or over the radio. And now the Buddha's advice during famines, it's interesting. The time will come when food is scarce and people will flee to crowded places where there is food. And therefore, it is not easy to practice the teaching if you have to go to such places, because the usual villages would have emptied. And in fact, there are more statements on this as to how people are carrying away their children and going in Pali. So, stated in Pali. So, what the Buddha says is, before this unwished, unwanted, undesirable situation comes, to arouse energy and attain the unattained, master the unmastered, and realize the unrealized. So that when this situation does occur, you will manage despite famine, because of the equanimity that you have and the ability to control all your feelings and desires. So in other words, we can see that famines were used or helped to motivate and energize the practice. I would like to share another sort of positive thing about famine, if you take it as positive. What are called Kala Dana. I don't know, I'm sure you have heard of Kala Dana, which depends on the timing of the dana. When to give a dana when it's most needed is much more meritorious, and there are 5 such danas mentioned. And famine, dubbike dubbikassa. Floods, natural disasters, that lot comes under where there is a famine or shortage. Secondly, dilanassa, somebody who is sick or disabled. Newcomers and visitors, agantukassa. This was a time when there were wandering ascetics. And they were another group who, if you wander into a place during a famine and, you are not used to the place, nobody is used to you. So that's another person who is really worthy of receiving a dana, like the sick, disabled, or the person who is really short of food. Anyone who is preparing, even during a famine or otherwise, preparing to leave, is also needing perhaps some help, especially if it is an ascetic, because they were moving from place to place, certain equipment regarding travel. And then the last one is to give from the first crop. It is said that Konnanya, the first to reach Sotappatti, the ascetic, who later Arahat Konnanya, had one in a previous life, this first crop, and wished this to be the first. So anyway, to give from the first crop is also has a timing, it is time bound. So that's another opportunity that famines will bring. The most vulnerable in all this, of course, is children. Then the sick and the differently able. And as we saw, people who are visiting and, who are really passing through. Now, because of our situation of famine plus a fuel crisis, I looked to see whether there was anything I could find on famine and a fuel crisis. Also, whether there was a famine and an economic crisis. And there are quite a few in a book on Buddhist environment, the nature and the environment in early Buddhism. and of how carpenters were coming and taking away trees, and how people lament that they were without firewood and wood for their daily needs. But this particular one, I thought I would put in here to the slide, how a besieged city, you besiege a city wanting it to surrender eventually, but by depriving it of food and water. But if you also deprive it of firewood, it is stated here in that Jigaccā, which is in the Khuddaka Nikaya, if you remove firewood also, it will rapidly surrender. That is what has happened here now. Not only is there no food, you can't cook it anyway. So there is all this commotion going on the road, at least as we see on the TV only so far for me. Anyway, there it is. In this area, we haven't had that. Besieged city, deprived of, anyway. So there it is, famine and fuel crisis. That's the only one I could really put up here. Then about the economic crisis, we have these statements. Idani ahara gavetti dukkham. If somebody has to go to long extents, great lengths to find food, it is a dukkha. People are, of course, expected to work hard. Uttanavato, satimato, mindfully and hard work was praised. And we have lots of sutras on that. But this is where you have to really sweat it out to find your daily bread. That is dukkha. Then there is yet another place where you find that poverty is suffering. And we know that hunger lurks wherever there is poverty. And very interestingly, sabbe janassa anavata, which I couldn't make out what. Thankfully, our patron, Venerable Sir, helped me. Janassa meant people, I knew, but anavata is to not shut. Annavata, not shut, keep it open to all. The benefits, the welfare must be basically evenly spread. In the Mahasudarsana Sutta, you find this. And now, I would like to, because children are the first targets, the first victims, and their needs cannot wait. So child poverty, without a doubt, increases morbidity and mortality. This is well known. Last night, having thought I had finished the slides, I picked up my computer and I found a journal to which I have subscribed, and I have also published in the Archives of Disease in Childhood, which is, I think, the most prestigious journal in the English language and pediatrics, had sent its new issue just yesterday. And there was this thing on child poverty. And strangely enough, they use these three, sort of use them as sort of tools or the framework within which child poverty will inflict, the worst effects. One is, they called it inverse care law. And that is exactly what these three were the three that I projected in the previous slide, if you were to remember. We said that having to go to great lengths to find food was not a good thing. So if the parents have to do that, the care the child gets is low. Whereas the advantaged parent and the advantaged child gets a lot of care. Whereas the disadvantaged child, who is the one who needs the care, gets no, because the parents are busy finding food. So that's known as the inverse care law, which is one way, the instrument through which the child is affected. The next one they call poverty stacks up against the child, which was the second one we said, that poverty brings suffering. Poverty stacks up lots of things, not just hunger, opportunities, schooling, lots of other things that the child lacks. Even affection from the parents in their absence, or the sense of security, not knowing where the next. So all that is going to leave a huge effect. And the third, they say, is poverty gets under the skin. Mind you, this is of children. And these children are going to grow up into adults. And even if, children don't have a vote, so somebody has to speak for children. And even if you could say, oh, certain diseases are adult diseases, many of them, the root started in childhood. So this is very dangerous to say that poverty gets under the skin unless there is equity of resources. We mentioned that there has to be equity of resources in that anavata, sabbe janassa anavata. That's what it is. If that doesn't happen, let us see what's going to happen if that doesn't happen. In the Cakkavatti Sihanada Sutta, the implications of poverty and hunger, and that it will lead to moral and spiritual decline. Now, last week we heard about corruption, and there was this debate subsequently. This does not mean whether that, corruption is there even in the affluent. Of course, similarly, moral and spiritual decline is there even in the presence of, great wealth. But that's not what we are trying to say here, that the poverty can also drive people who were not immoral and who were not in a spiritual decline. They could be driven to that. So it's a driver. So we here have in the Cakkavatti Sihanada Sutta, it's a busy slide. You can ignore the bottom because that's all the Pali of what is translated into English at the top. If resources are not given to destitutes, so there we are talking of equity also, poverty becomes rife. So if the gas and the fuel are not distributed with any sense of equity, then there are going to be trouble. Poverty in that, even poverty for fuel will become rife. And with that increasing, from the increase of poverty, taking what was not given increases. So from the increase of thefts, the use of weapons increase. From the increase of use of weapons, the taking of life increases, and from the increase of taking life, lying increases. And increase of lying, backbiting increases. And with the increase of backbiting, sexual misconduct. And this goes on with a host of vices and successive events can eventually lead to a complete Holocaust. This is what the Cakkavatti Sihanada Sutta, the discourse to universal monarchs, say. And next week's Kutadanta Sutta is the other one. These are the two main suttas on this type of sentiment. But I think we have now seen, as I said at the start, the social aspects of hunger being the worst illness. Other illnesses will not cause all this. You might die of it, but it doesn't cause a Holocaust in the country or in the community. Right. Now, having said that, we all remember what we were and we are, though we don't have the means to give it now. The dun cell, I don't think there is any country in the world, like in Sri Lanka, where there were dun cells on Poya days, just being given, not necessarily because there was a famine, but with kindness and generosity and a very great community spirit. So the dun cell is something that we are used to. Now, what is the relief measures? I said I ended the roadmap with relief measures. It would be karuna, which is the kindness and generosity, together with, of course, karuna is compassion and empathy as well. All very close, but it's got all that. So that would be on a sort of short term or small scale even. Acts of karuna could be one thing that could be done, like the kaladanas and things. Now, I like to tell about Bhikkhu Bodhi, whom many of you know. Bhikkhu Bodhi is an American Buddhist monk, Theravada monk, who, somebody please mute your mic, please, guys. Bhikkhu Bodhi lived 20 years in Sri Lanka and now has very influential writing and a large following. And Bhikkhu this realized, way back in 2007 this was, that the American Buddhist community, who were very greatly convinced and had confidence in the Buddha's teachings, and they were engaged in meditation, but they lacked empathy for those in disadvantaged situations. So he drew attention to this with a movement, a plea for compassion in action. And that has today grown into a massive movement called the Buddhist Global Relief, which you could, see on the internet. And what I'd like to impress upon is that their motto, their statement is that they are guided by Buddhist teachings. We strive to relieve chronic hunger worldwide. So again, it's chronic hunger that is pinpointed, and not any other discomfort or anything else. And that is the recent Vesak. That was the thing, honor the Buddha with a deed of compassion. So with that, now we know that in Sri Lanka, dana was, as we saw in the previous slide, dana is something we engage in a lot. And generally speaking, more dana than meditation, although today meditation is. So even to those who are into deep meditation, it doesn't mean that the dana can be forgotten. So it has to be a good balance. And with that thought, I would like to end this presentation. Thank you very much for your patient listening. And sorry for that interruption.
Thank you very much, Manouri, for such an excellent presentation. The lecture was so comprehensive. My God, you have done a lot of research in probing into just one small topic.